Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The town of Alicia sat between red earth and restless road, a hush of roofs and restless palms not far from the traffic that pushed from Abaddon to a cure like a river that forgot how to stop. In that town lived Clara Benson, a woman whose wealth was a tree with deep roots, yet whose heart felt like a cracked calabash that held only echoes. Her father had traded palm oil from Onitsha to Kano, counted bales by lantern light, and taught her to measure profit with eyes that saw both weight and weather. When he died, the air in their compound felt heavier, like rain refusing to fall, and Clara learned that grief is a long market where you bargain with silence. She kept his businesses breathing, adjusted prices when trucks delayed on the Lagos or road, and refused to dress her power with noise. People said she could buy a house in Abuja and never sleep in it, yet she greeted market women like old friends and never crossed a gate without knocking. She moved like morning, unhurried, patterned, and faithful, while rumors traveled faster than motorcycles. Some said she had the eyes of a hawk and the patience of a tortoise. Some said men feared her shadow, not her smile. Still she smiled, because smiles cost little and keep the peace. She walked the laterite paths at dusk, counting fireflies the way she counted blessings, telling herself that kindness was a door that never rusts. She listened for her father's voice in the rustle of the mango leaves, and sometimes she heard it, a low drum. Don't spend your name like loose change. She learned early that money can feed a city and still starve a soul, and she carried that knowledge the way a trader carries a ledger, close to the chest and balanced. When visitors spoke of luxury apartments by Victoria Island, she nodded and poured water, remembering that tides rise and fall and houses can forget who built them. When cousins from Enugu bragged about new ventures, she sent yams, not lectures, because food does more work than pride. Alicia watched her like a game of Ao under a neem tree, waiting for a move, admiring the calm. And though she had suitors, they came like harmattan dust, everywhere, then gone when the first rain arrived. She learned the small tests, how a man speaks to a waiter, how he greets a guard, how he laughs when the bill appears. She learned to keep her heart tucked where hands cannot reach without permission, and she wore her caution like coral beads, visible, beautiful, and not for sale. In the mornings, she thanked the sun for showing up. At night, she thanked the moon for minding its business. She began each day like ritual and remedy, wrapping her hair in a simple scarf, stepping out when the first buses coughed toward a cure, and greeting Mama Folu at the corner stall where ripe plantains leaned like tired heads. Alicia woke in beats, tin roofs yawning, goats arguing, kettles sighing like old men, and Clara moved through it with a quiet that turned heads without trying. On market days, she visited the drivers who ferried goods from Lagos, listened as they swore that mile 12 never sleeps, and blessed them with cola nut and a small envelope because kindness travels better than fuel. She checked ledgers in a shop that smelled of soap and wood, tracing lines with a pencil that knew her fingers like road-nosed tire. When a price fell, she didn't shout. She adjusted supply with the patience of cassava in the ground. She hated waste and loved order, yet she understood that people are not crates, so she allowed mistakes like weather, expected, noted, forgiven. The women at Oja Oba in a cure hailed her with songs when she came, because she bought from them in rain and sun, never haggling until pride turned sour, never walking away because a coin felt stubborn. She believed a deal is a handshake that should look you in the eye. When a young boy from Benin City came seeking work, she asked about his mother first, then handed him broom and broom-sized responsibilities with a promise. Sweep the truth into the open, and you'll eat with the honest. At dusk, she stood by the gate and watched trucks thunder toward Owo, headlights like thoughts that refused to rest, and she told herself that movement is not the same as progress. Neighbors nudged one another, whispering about age and marriage, and the clock that ticks in a woman's body like a careful thief. Some brought prayer partners from Abaddon who spoke in long vowels and longer prophecies. Clara smiled, offered water, and kept her peace like a locked drawer. She would not hurry her heart, because a calendar shouted her name. She knew the proverb, when you chase the wind, you catch dust. In quiet hours, Clara remembered the journey that had shaped her spine, and she understood why it curved where it did. As a child, she stood in Onitsha Main Market, staring at mountains of peppers and baskets of stories, while her father measured trust by how a hand returned change. He traveled with her to Kano, where the air carried the smell of leather and dawn rose wide like a bowl. He taught her to read faces and invoices, to listen when a seller's eyes blinked faster than his words. In Port Harcourt, she watched rain stitch the sky shut and reopen it with needles of lightning, the streets holding water the way a secret holds guilt. In Abuja, she learned that buildings can be tall and hearts small, and that offices with cool air may carry hot intentions. Her father said a proverb for every corner: count your chickens, but feed your hens. Carry your umbrella even on clear days. Ask for directions, but choose your driver. When death came to him, it was a soft thief, and he left with a sigh that felt like an old door finally closing. Clara stayed, tending palm groves near Benin City, managing warehouses that coughed dust if neglected, and running routes that connected Enugu, Ilorin, and back home like beads on a well-tied string. She wasn't a saint. She liked good fabric from ABA and sneakers that made walking feel like music, but she wore them without trumpet. Loneliness lived beside her like a quiet tenant who paid rent with silence. Suitors came, bearing jokes, perfume, and polished promises, and she learned to let them perform until their rehearsed lines lost rhythm. Some asked for joint ventures before joint prayers. Some praised her mind while counting her money with their laughter. She kept company with books because paper never rolled its eyes, and the radio because voices travel without asking for keys. When night stretched long, she sipped ginger tea and wrote lists of what tomorrow could forgive, then folded them into the desk as if tucking a child to sleep. Her faith was simple: do right, pay people, keep your gate open to light and closed to trouble, let dawn find you with clean hands. Hope visited like a bird, uninvited, brief, and beautiful, and she stopped shooing it away. Rain announced itself that season like a messenger who refused small talk, drumming on corrugated roofs until puddles learned patience. Alicia smelled of wet dust and leaf veins, the sky wearing the color of unripe guava, while the wind combed mango trees with fingers that knew every knot. Clara watched from her veranda, wrapped in a shawl the color of quiet, listening to thunder grumble like an uncle warning children to behave. She thought of Lagos traffic and how headlights form a necklace that stretches from Ojota to dreams, and she wondered if love traveled like those lights, slow, blinking, inevitable. She did not ask for a miracle, only for a companion who would walk where she walked and call her by her name without bleeding. She promised herself nothing rash. Even a hungry goat must not swallow a drum. When she visited the chapel off the road to a cure, she lit a candle and kept her prayer short, because God hears whispers better than speeches. On her way home, she gave a lift to a tailor from Ogbomoso, whose laughter sounded like rain on zinc, and she remembered that shared rides can carry healing. That night, the generator hummed like a tired bee. Neighbors laughed at a football match crackling from a transistor, and the scent of frying pepper soup wandered over the fence as if it had lost its address. The world felt wide and near at once. She set her ledger aside and allowed the rain to finish its sentence. Somewhere beyond the bend where the road turned impatient toward, or a bus hissed to a stop, its door yawning like a secret about to escape. Clara did not know it, but storms sometimes bring more than water. They carry faces, footsteps, and choices wrapped in wet cloth. When she closed her eyes, a gust slipped through the rooms, shaking curtains like startled birds, and the gate gave a little sigh as if greeting a traveler. She did not rise to check. Not yet. She believed doors should knock twice before you rush to open them, and hearts should knock longer. The night kept its counsel, the moon stepped behind a shawl of cloud, and in the softened darkness, the future shuffled its feet at the threshold, patient as a cat waiting for milk. The night Daniel arrived in Alicia was one of those nights that felt carved out of mystery itself, a night where the wind carried more questions than answers, and the rain poured like heaven was bent on cleansing the earth of its burdens. The compound where Clara lived had known many visitors, traders, relatives, wandering souls seeking directions to a cure, but something about the stranger standing at the gate that evening unsettled even the silence of the trees. His figure, tall and lean, stood against the backdrop of heavy rainfall, his soaked shirt clinging to his frame, a brown bag dangling at his side as though it carried all his secrets. Sola, the gatekeeper, a man who had grown into the rhythm of Clara's compound like an old drum, held an umbrella, watching the stranger with suspicion sharp enough to cut through the storm. Daniel's voice, though humbled by the downpour, was steady as he explained that he had been on the road from Abadan, that the rains had caught him unprepared, and that he sought nothing more than shelter for the night. From her veranda, wrapped in her shawl, Clara's eyes lingered on him. There was something about the way he stood, unbroken by the storm, yet not arrogant, that tugged at the part of her heart that had grown used to solitude. The lantern at her side flickered, its light stretching over the wooden floor like a hand reaching into the dark. She should have turned away, should have left the matter for Sola to decide, but her instincts, those quiet murmurs inherited from her father's wisdom, pushed her to lean forward and call out through the rain, "Let him in." At that moment, the storm seemed to bow to her voice, and the gate creaked open to welcome a man who would soon alter the rhythm of her carefully guarded life. Morning did not wash away the memory of the stranger's arrival, for the compound now carried a new energy, the kind that follows an interruption, whether welcomed or not. Clara rose early, as she always did, her scarf tied firmly around her head, her wrapper knotted neatly at her waist. The dew still clung to the leaves of the mango tree, and the red earth beneath her feet felt damp and cool. Daniel, to her surprise, was not lazing like a guest who felt entitled to hospitality. Instead, he was in the storehouse, sleeves rolled up, carrying sacks of Gary as if he had lived in the compound all his life. Sola, broom in hand, swept the compound with deliberate strokes, but his eyes never strayed too far from Daniel, as if the man's presence was a puzzle he refused to solve too quickly. Clara took her place at the wooden desk by the veranda, spreading out her invoices, the careful order of her ledgers a reminder of the discipline that had built her fortune. Her pen moved slowly across the paper, but every so often her eyes drifted toward Daniel, who lifted each sack with the ease of one used to labor. His silence was not the silence of pride but of thought, and there was a humility in the way he worked that disarmed her caution, even if only for a moment. The goats wandered lazily nearby, their bleating blending with the sounds of the morning market beyond the compound walls. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the rhythm of life carried on, but Clara could not shake the feeling that a new thread had been stitched into her story, one she had not chosen, but which demanded her attention. In the days that followed, Daniel's presence settled into the compound like a stone into a riverbed, altering its current but not its essence. He accompanied Clara to Awena market, where the hum of trade was a language of its own, and where every step she took was greeted with whispers that clung to her like shadows. "Is that her husband?" the market women asked in voices loud enough to be heard yet soft enough to be excused as mere curiosity. Clara bargained as she always did, her tone even, her knowledge of prices sharper than any blade, but she felt the weight of eyes on her back. Daniel carried baskets filled with peppers and vegetables, his figure blending with the market crowd, his humility disarming the gossip that sought to define him too quickly. The stalls overflowed with colors, red peppers piled high, kegs of palm oil glistening under the sun, fabrics stretching like rainbows across wooden beams. Traders called out their prices, children tugged at their mothers' wrappers, and goats wandered as though the chaos belonged to them. Clara moved through it all with the dignity of one accustomed to being observed, but beside her Daniel's quiet attentiveness drew more whispers. Some saw devotion in the way he lingered by her side, while others saw strategy in his patience. For Clara, the truth was harder to define. She was a woman who had lived long enough to know that appearances were as deceptive as water in a calabash, calm on the surface, swirling beneath. Still, she allowed him to walk with her, not because she trusted him yet, but because life had taught her that even caution must sometimes sit with curiosity. The journey to Lagos came unexpectedly, born out of Clara's business obligations rather than any desire for adventure. Yet when she decided to travel, Daniel was the one who offered to accompany her, and against her better judgment, she allowed it. They set out in a Hilux vehicle, the road stretching ahead like a ribbon stitched between villages and cities. Clara drove with the composure of one who understood the weight of responsibility, her eyes fixed on the expressway, while Daniel sat beside her, maps and a notebook resting on his lap. The road was alive with movement, buses overloaded with passengers, trucks carrying goods toward the port, and vendors weaving between vehicles, their trays of oranges balanced with impossible grace. As they neared the third mainland bridge, clouds gathered in the distance, heavy and dark, like omens waiting to speak. Lagos loomed ahead, its skyline faint against the horizon, the promise of business and burden intertwined. Clara's hands gripped the wheel firmly, her face calm, her thoughts hidden, while Daniel stole glances at her, admiration flickering in his eyes. To him, perhaps, she was more than a woman of wealth. She was the embodiment of resilience, of dignity carried without arrogance. To her, he was still an enigma, a man whose presence had not yet explained itself fully. The bridge stretched before them, long and unyielding, like the path of trust itself, difficult to cross, dangerous if rushed, but necessary for anyone seeking what lay beyond. In that moment, as the Hilux moved steadily toward Lagos, the story of Clara and Daniel deepened, not with declarations or promises, but with the quiet tension of two lives learning to walk the same road. The days in Alicia began to carry a softer rhythm once Daniel's presence grew more regular, like a new drumbeat folding itself into an old song, until no one could tell where the first bar started or where the last ended. He was not a man who rushed at words or flung them about like a market crier competing with noise. Instead, he spoke with measured pauses, seasoning conversations the way a cook seasons soup, careful not to ruin the broth with too much salt. Clara found herself laughing more than she had in years, sometimes at small jokes he delivered under his breath, sometimes at the way he folded daily frustrations into proverbs that sounded older than he was. One morning, as they walked to the Oja-Oba market in Akure, a stubborn goat broke loose from its tether and charged across the road, scattering traders who balanced tomatoes on their heads, and Daniel caught Clara's elbow just in time, pulling her aside before the animal brushed past. Even goats sometimes forget who owns them, he joked, and Clara laughed, though in her heart, the laughter felt unfamiliar, like an old song rediscovered after years of silence. That day, Daniel carried her baskets with no fuss, letting her handle negotiations while he blended into the background like a supportive shadow, his presence steady but not overbearing. The traders noticed, whispering among themselves, and when Clara moved from stall to stall, more than one woman leaned closer, nudging her neighbor and remarking that perhaps at last she had found a man who understood balance, the kind who respected her independence yet knew how to lend his strength without demanding applause. As the sun leaned westward, they returned home, and Clara realized that the journey had not felt like a burden, but like shared company on a long road. That night, she sat by her window, looking at the sky over Alicia while fireflies blinked like tiny lanterns, and she thought of her father, wondering if he would have approved of this man, who seemed content to stand in her shadow without stealing her light. She remembered his voice saying, "Test a man's humility not in wealth but in waiting," and she found herself repeating it under her breath before sleep claimed her. She did not know it yet, but the threads of attachment were weaving quietly into fabric, one small kindness at a time, until a cloth of affection was beginning to cover her carefully guarded heart. With each passing week, Daniel and Clara's paths wound closer, like two streams discovering they share the same valley and deciding to flow side by side. He began to accompany her on trips beyond Alicia, riding with her to Ilorin to meet distributors, or to Ibadan where warehouses stood like silent witnesses of commerce. On these journeys, Daniel revealed parts of himself she had not seen during his first days in her compound. A storyteller who could turn the frustration of waiting at a fuel station into comedy, or the memory of nearly missing a ferry in Port Harcourt into an adventure. Clara listened, amused, and though she did not always believe every detail, she admired the way he turned even misfortune into a lesson. He spoke often of patience, comparing life to a long road with checkpoints. Sometimes bribes delay you, sometimes potholes slow you down, but steady driving gets you there eventually. Clara admired this attitude, for it echoed the wisdom her father had left her, though Daniel's version carried humor instead of stern warnings. When they stopped for meals on the road, Daniel ate with gratitude, thanking the food vendor in Yoruba even when his accent betrayed him, and laughing at himself when corrected. "A traveler must learn to mispronounce before learning to belong," he said once, and Clara shook her head, hiding her smile. By the time they returned to Alicia after such journeys, the villagers' whispers had shifted. No longer did they only marvel at Clara's wealth. Now they commented on the companionship that followed her footsteps, saying perhaps her days of solitude had finally folded their mats. Some older women began to sing her praises more loudly at the chapel, nudging her during sermons that spoke of companionship and unity. Even the young ones teased gently, asking if she would soon throw a celebration grand enough to bring dancers from Lagos and trumpeters from Benin. Clara brushed these comments aside, but inside she knew her heart was no longer standing guard as it once had. She found herself waiting for Daniel's laughter, noticing the gap when he was absent, and smiling when his words returned to fill it. The companionship grew into something heavier, something sweet yet frightening, like palm wine that tastes innocent until it begins to cloud your steps, and Clara, though cautious, allowed herself to drink deeper from the cup each day. The turning point arrived one evening beneath the mango tree in her compound, when the air smelled of roasted corn from a roadside cellar, and the sky folded itself into sheets of purple. Daniel sat with Clara, and their conversation, usually light with laughter, turned serious as the evening deepened. He spoke of loneliness, admitting that though he had traveled wide, from Calabar to Abuja, he had never found a place that felt like home. His eyes softened as he confessed that Alicia, with its quiet rhythm and its people who valued respect, had begun to feel like a ground he could finally plant roots in. Clara listened, her chest tightening with an emotion she dared not name, as he spoke about wanting a partner who understood the weight of responsibility, someone he could laugh with, work with, and build with. His words were not flamboyant, not embroidered with poetry, yet they carried sincerity that touched her in places she had walled off for years. When he looked into her eyes and told her that her kindness had taught him the meaning of belonging, she felt her defenses tremble. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of meaning, like the pause before a drumbeat that changes the dance. Clara lowered her gaze, fiddling with the edge of her wrapper, and when she looked back, she simply said, "We will see what God writes." That night, she found herself restless, pacing her room as if waiting for answers from walls that only reflected her own heart back at her. She thought of her father's caution, the way he used to test people before trusting them, yet she also remembered his advice that love requires courage, for even the strongest wall can become a prison if it refuses to open its gate. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's attentions grew gentler yet firmer, and Clara realized she was no longer merely entertaining company. She was sharing her days with a man who had, slowly and quietly, become part of her rhythm. She began to imagine a future with him, not just as a visitor in her compound, but as a partner in her life. The thought scared her, but it also warmed her, like dawn arriving after a long night of cold. The eventual proposal came without pomp, on a day when neither expected it. They had gone to a small riverside in Owo to oversee a delivery of palm kernels, and after the work was done, they lingered by the water, watching children chase each other with laughter that rose higher than the river's song. Daniel stood beside her, silent for a while, then suddenly dropped to one knee, pulling out a small ring that glinted in the fading light. His voice was low but steady as he said her name, asking her not just to share her wealth, but to share her life, her laughter, and her future with him. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The workers nearby, sensing something sacred, turned away respectfully, leaving them alone in that moment. She felt the weight of years of solitude pressing against her ribs, but she also felt the pull of something stronger. Hope, companionship, the possibility of building a family that was not bound only by blood but by choice. She did not answer at once. She let the river whisper, let the wind test her resolve, and then, with a trembling smile, she said yes. The news spread quickly through Alicia like fire through dry grass. The villagers rejoiced, elders blessed the union, and even the skeptical tongues found themselves silenced by the sight of Clara finally opening her heart. The wedding was not extravagant, though it drew people from Abadan, Acure, and beyond. There was drumming, singing, and dancing that shook the dust from the ground, as neighbors joined hands and celebrated a union that seemed like destiny itself. For Clara, the day felt like a new dawn, one that promised laughter, companionship, and a future she had long believed might never come. As she looked at Daniel during the ceremony, her heart whispered a prayer of gratitude, believing she had finally found what wealth could not buy. She did not know, not yet, that even the brightest dawn can carry shadows waiting patiently for their time to stretch across the light. The first months after their wedding carried the fragrance of new beginnings, like fresh yams sliced open with the sap still glistening, and Clara felt as though life had finally remembered her name after years of calling everyone else's. The compound in Alicia wore joy like a new wrapper. Neighbors stopped by more often, women brought bowls of soup as gifts, and children sang songs through the gates when Daniel and Clara returned from trips together. Daniel himself seemed attentive, rising early, sweeping the veranda, greeting the elders who passed by the street, and walking with Clara through markets where their joined presence drew curious glances. At the chapel, he clasped her hand during hymns, singing softly enough that she had to lean closer to hear, and the villagers admired the sight of a couple that looked balanced, as if one was a calabash and the other its cover. But beneath the beauty of those days, little seeds of unease began to take root. Daniel spoke often of unity in marriage, of how what is mine is yours and what is yours is mine. And while the words sounded harmless, even sweet, Clara noticed how his gaze sometimes lingered on her ledger books, how his questions often returned to matters of profit and supply chains. Once, while eating supper, he casually asked how much her largest warehouse in Abadan was worth, his tone playful, yet his eyes watching sharply. Clara laughed and gave a vague answer, steering the conversation toward lighter matters, but she tucked the moment into memory, as a farmer hides a suspicious seed aside, not yet certain whether it is weed or crop. At night, Daniel sometimes returned later than expected, carrying the smell of palm wine and laughter, explaining that friends from Port Harcourt or Abaddon had visited and insisted on hospitality. Clara trusted him, for love had a way of covering blemishes like a wrapper tied tightly, but she felt a small sting each time, a whisper that warned but was too faint to silence her growing affection. She reminded herself that marriage is not a bed without wrinkles, and perhaps she simply needed to adjust her expectations. After all, had she not prayed for companionship? Had she not promised herself that suspicion must not choke love before it had grown? So she folded her doubts away, convincing herself that Daniel's interest in her wealth was only natural curiosity from a man learning to share her burdens. Yet the house seemed to know more than she admitted, for the walls echoed differently when Daniel's friends came to visit, their laughter too loud, their jokes lingering too long, and their eyes carrying a glint that made her skin prickle. Still, she told herself the proverb she had often repeated in her youth: when you look too hard for a snake, you may mistake a rope for its shadow. Daniel's friends arrived like evening storms, sometimes expected, sometimes sudden, and each visit left behind a residue of unease, like muddy footprints across a freshly swept floor. They were men with heavy laughs, men who leaned too close when they greeted, and men whose compliments always carried more weight than necessary. One in particular, a wiry man who introduced himself as Chike from Enugu, had the habit of praising Clara's cooking with such exaggeration that it felt less like gratitude and more like theater, his words dripping too much sugar to be sincere. Another, Tun from Lagos, often steered conversations toward business, asking about the size of her fleet of trucks, about profit margins in palm oil, and though he asked with the air of casual interest, Clara sensed the probing beneath the surface. Daniel, however, never seemed uncomfortable with these questions. Instead, he encouraged them, nodding and laughing, sometimes adding small details that Clara herself had not disclosed openly. "Ah, my wife runs operations tighter than any man could," he once boasted, and though his tone sounded admiring, the words made Clara's chest tighten. She wondered why Daniel spoke so freely, why he allowed outsiders to drink from the well of her private affairs, yet she kept her silence, not wishing to sow discord in their home. One evening, as the men drank palm wine until their voices grew coarse, Clara lingered by the doorway, listening to their laughter. She noticed the way Daniel's chest puffed with pride when they teased him about marrying a woman of means, how he laughed along when they joked that he had not only won a wife but also a treasury. Clara felt her stomach knot, yet when Daniel caught her gaze and winked playfully, she forced a smile, reminding herself that jokes are often careless, not confessions. Still, as she cleared the cups later that night, she thought of her father's words. A man who allows strangers to weigh his household is a man who does not mind them tipping the scales. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, telling herself that she was imagining shadows where only laughter had lived, but sleep came slowly, as if reluctant to share her bed with doubt. Over time, Daniel's suggestions about merging their affairs grew more frequent, his voice coated with tenderness, but his persistence sharp as a knife wrapped in velvet. "Clara," he would begin, holding her hand as though the gesture could soften his words, "why should we keep two ledgers when God has already joined us as one? Let us pool our resources, build bigger together, expand beyond Alicia, beyond Abaddon. Imagine the empire we could create." His argument sounded convincing, dressed in the language of unity, yet Clara's instincts stirred like restless birds. She thought of the parable of the tortoise, who borrowed a feather from every bird until he flew high, only to betray them once he reached the feast. She responded with patience, telling Daniel that they had time, that love needed no rush, that a house built too quickly may fall with the first storm. Daniel would sigh, sometimes laugh, sometimes act wounded, saying she did not trust him enough, but then he would kiss her forehead and assure her he would wait. These exchanges repeated themselves like seasons, his pressure, her deflection, his charm, her caution. Yet in between, life carried on, and Clara could not deny that Daniel remained attentive in many ways, helping with accounts, accompanying her on trips, standing by her side during community gatherings. The villagers admired him more and more, calling him a model husband, praising Clara for her fortune, not only in wealth but in love. And Clara, though still guarded, allowed herself to hope that perhaps her fears were nothing but the residue of too many years spent alone. Still, whenever she placed her pen to sign a new contract, she caught Daniel's eyes watching the stroke of her signature, his expression unreadable, and her heart would flutter uneasily. It was as though she stood at the edge of a forest, sensing rustling in the underbrush, but unable to see the creature that stirred within. One particular night, the tension reached a point Clara could no longer ignore. Daniel had returned home with two of his friends, their laughter loud enough to shake the compound walls. Clara prepared their meal, serving with the grace of a hostess, even though her heart resisted. As the men ate and drank, she lingered outside the room, listening. Their conversation flowed with careless confidence, spilling details and laughter like palm wine foaming over a gourd. One of them remarked, "Daniel, you've truly struck gold with this woman. We should all learn from you." The words were followed by uproarious laughter, and Daniel's voice rose above it, proud, not embarrassed. "Ah, my brothers, winning her heart was the challenge. But once you win the heart, the rest follows easily." The men laughed louder, clapping him on the back, and Clara's blood ran cold. She could not tell if they spoke in jest or in truth, but the tone pierced her more deeply than any knife could. She stepped back into the shadows, her chest tight, her breath uneven. For the first time, she wondered if love had blinded her too completely, if her heart had become the very trap she once swore she would avoid. That night, when the men finally left and Daniel stumbled to bed with wine on his breath, Clara remained awake by the window, staring into the dark. The mango leaves rustled as if whispering warnings she had ignored for too long, and the moon cast a pale light over the compound, indifferent to the battles unfolding within human hearts. Clara pressed her hands together, whispering a prayer for wisdom, her mind torn between loyalty and suspicion, between love and caution. She had not yet reached the edge of betrayal, but she could feel its shadow creeping closer, silent and patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The night that broke Clara's fragile calm arrived without warning, carried on the back of a silence too heavy for evening. Daniel returned earlier than usual, his face wearing the smile he often kept in reserve for moments when persuasion was his weapon. He carried in his hand a stack of documents, neatly folded and pressed flat, as though the weight of ink and signatures could be disguised by orderliness. With tenderness laced in his tone, he told Clara that it was time to formalize what love had already written on their hearts. "We have lived as one in every sense," he said, his fingers brushing the edge of her arm. "Why then should our possessions remain scattered, as though we are still strangers testing the ground?" His words dripped with warmth, and his eyes tried to soften her suspicion, but Clara's ears heard only the insistence beneath the sweetness. She took the papers from him with steady hands, reading through the fine print by the yellow glow of the lamp. The document spoke plainly: transfer of ownership of her businesses, estates, and investments into joint names, with Daniel's written as primary signatory. Clara's breath caught in her chest, but she masked her alarm with calm. She reminded herself of the tortoise who never showed his full shell at once, who always kept something hidden, and she folded the papers back neatly, thanking him in a tone that betrayed nothing. That night, as he whistled softly in the veranda, Clara excused herself, claiming she was weary. She went into her room, locked the door, and sat by her desk, her mind a whirlpool of thoughts. She had never felt the walls of her compound so close, so suffocating, as if every brick was leaning forward to ask, "What will you do now?" The pen in her drawer suddenly felt like both a weapon and a chain. She placed it on the table, stared at the documents again, and tried to convince herself it was all born of love. Yet something inside her, a quiet voice she had ignored too long, rose like harmattan dust, reminding her that trust without caution is like fire carried in dry grass. When Daniel finally came to bed, his breath smelling faintly of cola and palm wine, Clara pretended to sleep, her back turned, her mind still restless. The documents remained on her desk, untouched, and the night stretched out like a long corridor with no visible end. The following morning, Clara awoke with a heaviness that refused to lift, no matter how brightly the sun shone over Alicia. She moved through her chores deliberately, her face composed, her steps measured, as though pretending that all was well could keep the truth from bursting open. Daniel ate his breakfast with casual chatter, speaking of opportunities in Lagos, of joint ventures in Abuja, and of plans that would set their legacy in stone. Clara nodded politely, hiding her storm behind a veil of calm, but inside, her spirit twisted. When he finally left to meet friends, she summoned her lawyer from Ibadan, a man who had served her father faithfully for many years. In the quiet of her sitting room, she spread the papers before him. He read carefully, his eyes narrowing, and when he finished, he placed them down slowly. "Madam," he said, his voice heavy with caution, "this is not unity. This is surrender. If you sign this, you will have handed everything to him." Clara's chest burned, not because she was surprised, but because the confirmation struck like a drumbeat in an empty hall, loud, echoing, undeniable. She thanked the lawyer, instructing him to prepare safeguards immediately, updated documents that secured her assets under tighter locks, new clauses that made transfers impossible without her sole approval, and instructions to watch her accounts like an eagle watching prey. She made these decisions without trembling, though her heart felt as though it had cracked in two. She wondered how much of her marriage had been built on lies, how many of Daniel's smiles had been rehearsals for deception. Yet she forced herself to keep steady, to play the game as carefully as he had, knowing that revealing her hand too soon would only give him ground to cover his tracks. That evening, when Daniel returned, she welcomed him with the same warmth as always, her lips forming a smile while her heart stiffened like cold iron. They ate together, spoke together, even laughed together, but Clara carried the secret knowledge that she had already shifted the chessboard beneath his feet. The hunter who believed he was stalking prey would soon find himself wandering in circles, unaware that the ground had been salted long before his trap was set. The real fracture came later that week, when Clara's suspicions finally gathered into certainty. The night was warm, and the compound was alive with Daniel's friends once again, their voices swelling with drink and careless jokes. Clara, sitting quietly by the edge of the corridor, pretended to busy herself with folding clothes, but her ears strained toward their laughter. It was Chike's voice she heard first, mocking yet congratulatory. "Daniel, my brother, you've truly proven us wrong. We thought the bet was impossible, that no woman so guarded, so cautious, could ever fall." The words pierced Clara like a spear, but she sat frozen, her hands trembling on the fabric she held. Then Daniel's voice rose above the noise, pride dripping from every syllable. "I told you all," he boasted, his laughter heavy with triumph. "Winning her heart was the hardest part, but once I did, the rest became easy. The wealth, that's the sweetest bonus." The room erupted in laughter, chairs scraping against the floor as the men clapped him on the back, raising their cups in mock toasts. Clara's breath hitched. The words rang again and again in her mind, so sharp they seemed to carve themselves into her soul. Every moment they had shared, every tender word, every gentle touch, all of it now felt poisoned, transformed into nothing more than a performance for his friends, a prize to be claimed, a bet to be won. She rose quietly, her face pale, her heart a stone. She slipped into her room, closing the door softly so as not to betray her tears, and there she sank into her chair, her body shaking with silent sobs. She pressed her palms to her face, remembering her father's warnings, the proverbs of the elders, the instincts she had silenced for love. It was all true. Daniel had never loved her for who she was. He had loved only the shine of her fortune. That night, Clara did not sleep. She sat awake, staring at the moonlight crawling across the floor, her mind torn between fury and despair. Her heart had been used as a wager, and her trust had been the currency with which Daniel had bought his pride among his friends. When dawn finally came, Clara's spirit felt both shattered and sharpened, like glass broken but glinting fiercely in the light. She prepared breakfast as usual, her face calm, her movements deliberate, so that Daniel would see nothing of the storm that raged inside her. He came to the table, smiling, unaware that she had already seen behind his mask, unaware that the game he thought he controlled had slipped from his grasp. He spoke casually of plans, of signatures needed, of future ventures waiting like fruits on branches. Clara listened, nodding at the right moments, but her mind was elsewhere, already strategizing. She would not confront him in anger, nor would she expose her discovery too soon. Instead, she would let him believe his performance still held sway, let him relax in the comfort of deception, until the moment came when she would reveal the truth. For now, she resolved to play her part well, to wear her calmness like armor, and to let silence be her weapon. After the meal, she excused herself to her study, where she met with her lawyer once more, instructing him to finalize the protections on her wealth, to create layers so dense that even Daniel's most cunning efforts would find only walls. "He must never know," she said firmly, her voice steady though her heart bled. "Let him believe he has won, until the day I show him the truth." The lawyer bowed his head, understanding, and promised to seal her fortune behind doors no hand could pry open. That evening, when Daniel sat beside her under the mango tree, speaking of dreams and possibilities, Clara smiled faintly, hiding her tears behind the mask she had chosen. She knew then that the love she thought she had found was dead, that her marriage was nothing more than a shell, but she also knew that she would not be the one defeated. If Daniel had placed a wager upon her heart, he would soon discover that some bets are lost in silence, and some games end not with applause but with shame. The morning after Daniel's departure, Alicia carried a silence that felt heavier than the dawn mist, a silence thick enough to be touched, as though the earth itself was brooding over what had unfolded. Clara stepped out of her compound, her shawl wrapped firmly around her shoulders, and walked slowly across the red earth road, her bare feet pressing against soil still damp from the night's rain. Every step she took was measured, as if she feared that if she moved too quickly, her strength would scatter like dust in the harmattan wind. Villagers leaned out from their doorways, their whispers hovering in the air like moths drawn to lantern light. She heard nothing distinct, only the rise and fall of hushed tones that carried curiosity, pity, admiration, and even doubt. Clara held a small leather-bound ledger close to her chest, not because she needed to account for anything in that moment, but because the book had become a symbol of her survival, of the wisdom that guided her steps when storms threatened to sweep her away. The morning breeze carried the scent of wet leaves and charcoal smoke, the distant sound of children chasing one another through narrow paths punctuating the quiet like bursts of forgotten joy. Palm trees swayed gently, their fronds brushing against the sky as though comforting it. Clara's face remained calm, but inside her, waves of sorrow rose and fell, for betrayal is not a wound that heals in a day, no matter how wealthy or strong the heart might be. Yet mingled with that pain was a strange clarity, a realization that she had not only protected her wealth, but also safeguarded her dignity, refusing to allow deceit to rewrite her story. By the time she reached the far edge of her compound road and turned back, the sun had climbed higher, and though her tears had not fallen, her resolve shone quietly in her eyes, steady as the light growing across the land. Later that same day, Clara returned to the veranda where the weight of decisions often found her, this time not alone but flanked by the people who had held her hand in silence when Daniel's mask slipped away. Her elderly lawyer from Abaddon, his gray beard glowing under the lantern light, sat at the wooden table, spreading out papers with the precision of a man who understood both law and loyalty. Beside him was a younger woman, an aide from a cure whose pen moved swiftly across a fresh ledger, capturing details that would secure Clara's estate against any future intrusions. The air was thick with seriousness, but it was not despair. It was the gravity of people determined to build walls high enough to keep treachery at bay. Clara sat straight-backed, her scarf tied firmly, her eyes shifting from paper to faces, gratitude mixing with determination in her expression. For once, she was not the solitary guardian of her father's legacy. She allowed others to carry part of the burden, to share in the work of protection. The mango tree outside rustled gently as if in approval, and goats wandered lazily near the compound walls, indifferent to the weight of human troubles. The lawyer's voice, low and steady, emphasized clauses that would preserve her assets, protect her business, and ensure that even whispers of deceit would find no soil in which to grow. The aide nodded at every instruction, recording each detail with the care of one who understood the importance of preservation. Clara listened intently, her lips pressed together, her thoughts wandering briefly to the path that had brought her here. The stormy night Daniel first appeared, the moments she let herself believe, and the bitter awakening that followed. Though her chest tightened at the memory, her spirit did not waver, for she now knew that strength was not in avoiding pain, but in surviving it without losing herself. As the lantern burned lower and the day wore into evening, Clara leaned back, exhaled deeply, and knew that she was not merely mending a broken wall. She was fortifying a fortress. Weeks later, when the rains gave way to brighter skies, Clara found herself standing at the banks of the Owena River, the same river that had witnessed laughter, trade, and quiet reflection for generations. The sunset painted the water in streaks of orange and purple, a canvas of healing laid out before her eyes. She wore a simple wrapper, her scarf tied neatly, her posture upright and unyielding. She gazed at the ripples on the water, her reflection mingling with the light, as though reminding her that even brokenness could create beauty when given time. Around her, villagers carried out their ordinary rhythms, women washing clothes by the water's edge, children splashing and giggling as though joy was their only inheritance, men casting nets and hauling them back with patient strength. Clara stood apart, yet not lonely. She felt part of the living current, connected to the community in a way she had long resisted. Her mind wandered, but this time not toward loss. Instead, she thought of resilience, of the quiet lessons her father's voice had impressed upon her as a child in the bustling Onitsha markets, that life was not about avoiding storms but learning to stand firm while they raged. The river whispered these truths back to her now, its current steady, its depth unwavering. Clara closed her eyes briefly, inhaled the smell of wet earth and river plants, and let the peace settle inside her like oil poured into water, spreading until it touched every hidden corner of her heart. By the time the sun dipped lower, and her reflection merged with the shadows, she felt lighter, not healed completely but transformed, her scars not chains but badges of endurance. As dusk wrapped itself around Alicia one evening, Clara opened her compound gates to her neighbors, not for business, not for trade, but for fellowship. Lanterns were hung on trees and verandas, their golden light spilling warmth across the red earth. Women came carrying bowls of steaming soup, roasted plantains, and calabashes of palm wine. Children ran excitedly, their laughter rising like flutes into the evening sky. Elders walked slowly, leaning on canes, their faces eager to witness the gathering. At the center of it all sat Clara, elegant in her scarf, her demeanor gentle yet commanding. Her voice, calm and steady, carried words not of wealth or caution but of wisdom, of the importance of guarding one's heart without closing it, of the need to balance trust with discernment. The market women leaned closer, nodding, their eyes wide with admiration. The children, though restless, listened with ears that caught fragments of her lessons. Even Sola, ever loyal, stood by the mango tree with quiet pride, his broom set aside as he watched his mistress rise above pain. Clara's face glowed not with triumph over others, but with the calm joy of one who had faced betrayal and chosen not to be defined by it. The villagers left that night not with stories of scandal, but with memories of light, for the compound had become a beacon of strength, resilience, and peace. Alone again after the gates closed, Clara looked up at the star-filled sky, her heart no longer heavy but steady, and whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for what she had lost, but for what she had found within herself. My dear listeners, in this life, never rush to place your trust where your spirit still whispers caution. A smiling face may hide sharp teeth, and sweet words can sometimes be a trap set in velvet. Test the heart, not just the tongue. Weigh actions more than promises. And remember, love that is genuine will never pressure you to surrender what you are meant to protect. Guard your peace, guard your values, and above all, guard your heart, for it is more precious than any fortune. May your eyes be open to see deceit before it ripens, amen. May your heart never be trapped in a love built on lies, amen. May every scheme fashioned against your joy scatter before it touches you, amen. May God send you true companionship that values you for who you are, not for what you carry, amen. And may your days be filled with laughter that comes from trust, with peace that comes from wisdom, and with love that stands the test of storms, amen and amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.